This is the Spyderco Little Sub Hilt. And this thing is a chunk of a knife, and I kind of wish Spyderco still made knives like this. So this knife is currently discontinued. It's a slightly older Spyderco model. I gather it was relatively well known back when it was around, in collaboration with Bruce Valentin. I'm assuming that Bruce pronounces his last name the same way that Rainey does, and I've heard Rainey pronounce it Valentin, so I'm pronouncing it that way. I've heard 7 different pronunciations, watching 7 different videos on YouTube. Rainey pronounced it Valentin. I try to make my knife reviews a single video that gives you everything you need to know about a knife, and everything you need to decide whether this is a knife that you want in your collection or not. And I go through that in 5 sections. First, we give a general overview. Then we talk about the blade, the handle and ergonomics, the fit, finish, and value, and then we finish with some overall thoughts. This is a very interesting knife. I'm going to try to make this a little bit shorter than some of the other ones, and let's get into it. So first off, overview and specifications. Again, this is a collaboration between Spyderco and Bruce Valentin. So Bruce Valentin is known for one thing in the knife world, which is these thumb studs right here. These external thumb studs, where you've got the sort of garaged thumb stud right there, where these are basically external stabilizers that are, preventing this blade from torquing. You see it on Hinderers, you see it on Medfords. Bruce was the guy who started that. So that is one of his signature features that you're seeing here on this knife. Bruce is also well known for his automatics in the custom world. And in fact, a lot of folks, these are very expensive, especially on the secondary market because they're so rare these days. But Bruce would actually take these Spydercos, both this little sub-hilt and its bigger brother, which is a downright massive knife, and he would convert them into autos, where it would either be, a button auto or a hidden button auto, something like that. Actually, well, they were all hidden button autos. This, I gather, is similar in design to one of his automatics. This is unavailable right now. There might be 1 or 2 kicking around a dealer somewhere, but my understanding is it's not in production anymore. This is made in Spyderco's Taichung, Taiwan factory. As you guys know, that means very high build quality and razor sharp tolerances. S30V is the blade steel here. It retailed for $310 from Spyderco directly. Was probably in the mid 200s from most retailers back when it was around. Again, made in Taichung here. Blade stock, 138 thousandths. That is pretty chunky. And pretty chunky, by the way, is something you can say about all of this knife. Look at how thick these steel handles and G10 overlays are. I mean, the fact is, it makes 310 blade stock look kind of thin because of how huge and thick these handle scales are. These scales are steel, I guess they're kind of bolsters, with G10 overlays. That is a polished G10 right there. Chamfered all around the edges, and that G10 is all over some thick steel liners. It is a liner lock. There's your liner lock access right there. On washers, and sure feels like it. Another little inlay that is also steel there. And then you've got a G10 backspacer. 138 thousandths on the blade stock. Blade is 3.24 inches long. And it is 7.4 inches overall. And then, as you might expect from something this thick, it's a little hefty. 5.2 ounces for 3¼ inches of blade. So this is not going to be one of your ratio champs. This isn't something, if you're trying to maximize ounce and inch or have something that's super easy to pocket, this is not the knife for you. Let's bring up some quick size comparisons. Here's your PM2. You can see it's not that much shorter in the blade than your PM2, maybe only a little bit shorter. The handle is quite a bit shorter than the PM2, but let's stand them up on their side. You can see much thicker and consequently much heavier than a PM2. Let's bring out my Atom, my beater Atom here. You can see it is a little bit shorter than the Atom in both the handle and the blade, and I'll just do this because it's hilarious. I mean, it's probably about twice as thick as the Atom. It's 50% thicker in the blade stock and probably about twice as thick in the handle. And then let's bring out our large Sebenza here. You can see not quite as big as the large Sebenza. Again, this is the little sub-hilt. The full-size sub-hilt would actually dwarf the Sebenza. That one is a truly massive knife that I have not gotten my hands on. In fact, let me just get one more quick. I will compare this to one other knife I've got of similar thickness. Review coming up on this guy, my Hinderer Eclipse. So if you want to compare this to a thick, hard use knife, you can see this is actually even still a decent bit thicker than a full thickness Hinderer Eclipse, and actually even weighs more than the Eclipse despite being a smaller knife. So in terms of length. So again, this is not a knife that you are going to carry if you care about minimizing weight, if you care about minimizing bulk in the pocket, any of that stuff. This just isn't your knife. Get it out of the way. You're going to think it's thick. You're going to think it's heavy. You're going to think it's dumb. That's fine. You're not the target audience. These aren't even being sold anymore. Just laugh when you see one get put up on the secondary market. And by the way, again, $200, $250 retail. These probably go right around that 200 mark on the secondary. The full-size Valentins tend to go for a little bit more. They're a little rarer. These ones you're probably talking about $200 in the secondary market. So those are your specs. Let's get into the knife, and we will start with the blade. And the blade is actually the most interesting part of this knife. So this is a downright weird blade design. If you take away the Spidey hole here, this actually looks like a pretty typical sort of slight drop point. You've got a relatively thin flat here. You've got a tip that is just above your pivot. You know, this kind of looks like almost something you'd see on like a slip joint or a gentleman's knife. If you ignore the grind and you ignore the Spidey hole here. You put the Spidey hole, and literally what they did is they just took a relatively normal knife blade and put a giant humpy spider hole right on top. Now that spider hole works great. It's really nicely positioned here, not knocked down like Tai Chung tends to do. There's a slight chamfer right on the edge, a little radius, but they haven't stonewashed the blade. It's a satin finish on the blade, as you can see there. So it doesn't get knocked down as a stonewash tends to do. Grabs your thumb really easily and rolls out just like that very nicely. I'm not going to try to spider flick it. I'm not a Spidey flicker, but the hole looks a little awkward, but it's great for deployment. By the way, these are not really thumb. You can use them as thumb studs, but honestly, you slip into the Spidey hole anyway. If it didn't have the Spidey hole, these would not be very good thumb studs. They're meant to be blade stops, not thumb studs. The other benefit of the Spidey hole here is you get some typical Tai Chung sharp jimping. Get in focus right there. Grips your thumb really nicely, and because you've got this sharp upward angle, you get a ton of purchase right here over this blade. Again, the blade's pretty far down below your thumb when you do that, but that's the other benefit of the Spidey hole. It gives you a thumb ramp here with some nice jimping. But that Spidey hole, even though it makes it look weird, isn't the most interesting part of the blade. The most interesting part is this grind. So this is a compound grind, which you don't see a lot out of Spyderco. And if you look sort of down the grind here, you can start to sort of see what it is. Again, 138 thousandth is pretty thick stock. Let's compare it to your PM2. It's a little bit, it looks thicker, but it's actually, no, that's what I thought. Yeah, that's an optical illusion. It's actually ever so slightly thinner than the PM2, which is 140 or 145 thousandths at its thickest point. But not only is it thick, but it keeps most of that thickness most of the way down the blade. You can see there's a flat that runs most of the way, and even once the flat runs out, it doesn't taper heavily. So this ends up feeling like pretty thick stock for a Spyderco. It feels more like a Shaman in terms of stock thickness than something like a PM2. But what they've done here is they have put a hollow grind below that flat. And this, just look at the base of the cutting edge there. Because of this hollow grind, on this main grind, this actually gets extremely sharp right behind the edge. And then up at the front here, because again, it's still pretty thick up at the tip, they put a flat grind and basically sort of ground this like a Tonto while shaping it like a drop point. It's kind of similar, less obvious, but kind of similar to how Rick Hinderer grinds his Spanto blade, where it is, again, the shape of drop point, but a grind that you would typically see on a Tonto. Now, there is an inevitability of 138 thousandths blade stock carried this far out, especially for tasks like cardboard or like cutting through carpet or some home improvement tasks where you're passing the whole blade through the material. You're still passing this thick blade stock through, and that is going to cause drag. But I bought this knife, and I bought it off the secondary. I bought this knife thinking that it would be a terrible cutter. I just assumed that this knife would be fun, it would be cool to play with, cool to have around, and I would hate it as a user. That has not been the case at all, and it is because of this hollow grind. For stuff where you're just using the edge, so anytime you're scoring something, anytime you're down on something, even if you're cutting through cardboard, you can often cut through cardboard where you're sort of scoring the surface, pulling down the whole way, cutting through twine, some light garden tasks, some lighter home improvement tasks, things like that. This thing is legitimately slicey. Like, it's not like it's slicier than you would think. It is actually slicey. It is actually really sharp with a great edge right from the factory and really nice grind lines. It's just pretty looking, and it performs really well. And on top of that, because this edge is so sharp, it's not bad going through cardboard and stuff like that. It is not bad in your usual everyday tasks. And in fact, it's pretty good just from a blade perspective. You've got a blade that, again, gives you tons of purchase here. You've got a very simple, versatile drop point. You've got tons of piercing power. Because of the way this is ground, you can stab this thing into something and because of these blade stops here, which give you tons of basically resistance against torque, you can stab this and crank on this all you want, and you do not have to worry about it. And if I compare this to something else that's thick, if I compare this to a Hinderer, and now you never really want to be comparing slicing performance to a Hinderer, then you've kind of lost the game anyway, but let's do it. This little sub-hilt, actually breaks down cardboard better and more easily from the perspective of the blade alone than this Hinderer. The Hinderer has even thicker stock, and that's why, but I just want to say, basically, I had an impression that this blade would be more aesthetic than functional. And because of that hollow grind specifically, let me just bring it up to the camera again, because it is a really, really, look on that plunge. You can see on the plunge how deep the hollow grind goes. It's just a really, really cool grind, and it's a really effective grind to boot. Again, if you hide this, you see that it is a typical drop point blade. It reminds you of something like your, Ace Sonoma that I reviewed a little while back. It's your steak knife shape, basically, with a little bit of a drop point, which means it's another one of those blade shapes. There's nothing really to remark about the blade shape. The blade is good at most things, terrible at nothing. The fact that this blade is so relatively shallow, and the fact that the grip sort of keeps you naturally pretty close to the blade edge, especially if you choke up, means that it does end up being very good for little fine detail cuts, again, and especially given that hollow grind, given how thin it is behind the edge, and not just behind the edge, but like this whole part down here where my thumb is running is pretty much flat. It's basically as thin as the edge all the way down here. It's only once you start to get like here that it starts to fatten up. This is actually a really good knife for this is a really good blade for a lot of everyday carry tasks. And that's really cool. Next thing, while we're transitioning from the blade to the handle, let's talk about the action. The action is another surprisingly great thing. So this is a Tai Chung knife, Tai Chung liner lock on washers. Tai Chung doesn't do a lot of liner locks. They have done a couple. One of my favorite Spydercos, the Sage one in Maximate, was a liner lock. And part of the reason that's one of my favorite knives from Spyderco is the action on that. Because Tai Chung's tolerances are so tight, their washer actions get just insanely glassy smooth. I mean, it's not even hydraulic like a Chris Reeve. It just feels like oil on glass. There's almost no resistance at all. The only time I've felt similarly smooth actions is either Customs or Medfords. Because, and you know, at some point I'll probably have a couple Medfords on the channel, but the fact is, say what you want about Greg Medford, I'm not going to opine on him or his brand right now, but at least in 2024, the dude knows how to make a knife, and some of his actions get phenomenal once they break in. This thing is about as good as anything that Spyderco makes in terms of action. Super smooth on the close, medium detent, nice and light. You can slow roll it on the open. I mean, it just feels, if you've had the Techno, or it's better than the Spidey Chef, and I haven't had a Swish Bowie, but it's probably similar to how people describe the Swish Bowie. It's a Taichung Taiwan washer action. I mean, when you fast roll it like that, you don't feel any friction. You don't feel any resistance. The blade just comes out. It feels effortless. It's a really nice action. There's no stops. There's no variation. Again, it feels like I can't think of any way to make the action feel better without the kind of insane finishing you get in customized. Now, one thing just to note is that the liner lock axis is a little weird. It sticks out pretty far. Basically what they did is just this liner just sticks out further. There's no really dedicated tab. It's literally just, you just put your thumb on the liner right there and disengage it. And it's fine. It does stick out a little bit far, but not enough that you feel it when you're gripping the knife. It's fine. Lockup seems secure. No issues with that. Yeah, action, solid. It's a smooth action, not a drop shot action, but it's solid. That all brings us to the handle and the ergonomics. And this handle is ridiculous. Yeah, this is a 5.2 ounce knife that is only 3¼ inches long. This handle is super, super fat. I mean, you've got relatively fat steel liners. Then you've got these huge slabs on top of the liners, both of G10 and then steel with G10 overlaid on it. I mean, the benefit of having, and it's all polished. Let's do the finishing on this first. Everything is polished pretty smooth. It's not like, you know, a Riot or a Custom. You can feel the transitions. There are little gaps there. And by the way, the steel parts are scratch magnets for sure. Also, the clip just looks a little ridiculous because the clip's so big and the knife's so small. But anyway, scratch magnets, but it's nicely put together. It's nicely finished. Everything is nicely rounded all around the edges. The whole thing is contoured, and there's a nice even contour. It's mostly a unidirectional contour, meaning just this way, not this way. There might be a little bit of this way, but honestly, if it was all this way, I would believe you. The finish on the G10 is very nice. It's very polished. It is downright slick. Feels like a bowling alley. The steel is kind of just a satin finish, but because this thing is so thick, it's heavy. When you hold this knife, the weight is all in your hand. You basically, you know, you could take this blade off and it would feel the exact same in terms of balance. When you have a handle this thick, there's an ergonomic inevitability that it's going to fit in the hand pretty nicely. Especially with this level of contouring. Honestly, it feels like, I mean, it's a dumb comparison, but it feels kind of like holding a relatively small banana. Like, it's just the way it's rounded, the way it's kind of blocky on the sides, and frankly, it's about the size of a relatively small banana. Like, it fits in your hand nicely. You've got some decent ergonomic lines. You've got basically 3 little scallops here, one behind your, one right behind your blade, one in the middle here, and then kind of a hump back there. Your hands fit nicely right behind there. First finger goes into this first groove, and then your last 3 fingers go back here, rounds toward the back to fit on the base of your palm. And just because it's so darn thick, it rolls into your hand very nicely. It's not a very tall knife. So this way, it's actually pretty slim. And so if it were thinner, it might actually be a little awkward in the hand. But because it's so thick, there's plenty to wrap your hand around. And it ends up feeling, even though it's slick, very secure in the hand, simply because Not only is it huge, but because this whole thing is flat, you can anchor basically the middle digits of your fingers on the base of this flat. It anchors right there. You anchor up on this jimping here with your thumb, and then this all goes right into the palm of your hand. This is very, very secure. If you want to pinch up, you can push this back into the palm of your hand, post your fingers down here, pinch into the spidey hole like that, and this works very well. Or even climb all the way up here. Also works well. This doesn't feel quite as secure. You don't exactly have a ton of grip down there, but you can do this for your detail cuts, your paring knife type stuff. The fact is, and then the ergonomic experience using it, I mean, the handle is so big and chunky that it's natural. And because it feels so secure in the hand, you do feel like you have tons of control over this blade. Part of the reason that it's, I think, even easier to do something like cut down cardboard than something like a Hinderer. Now that's not that Hinderer's the best knife in the world for that. Like, this isn't elite for those tasks, but part of the reason it's really good is because that handle is so chunky. You get a very secure grip, and so even when that blade stock starts to become an issue, when that 138 thousandths becomes a problem, it feels so secure that you can just push right through it. That's the benefit of a big ergonomic handle like this, is you don't feel the downside of thick blade stock quite as much because it's easier to push through. Whereas if this was a smaller handle, as soon as you felt that resistance, it would start to get squirrely in your hand and it would be very unpleasant. This just feels like the hard use knives of 4 or 5 years ago, the things that were hot. It's a more refined version of that, especially with that slicer hologram. But this gets you that same sort of sensation of something that is like bolted into your hand a little bit. Again, in this case, it's not because of the ergonomic lines, it's because the thing is just so darn big that there's plenty of space to grip onto. And because of that, you don't need to go crazy with the ergonomic lines. You don't need a super thin blade stock. And it just works. Now, there's an obvious downside to having all this handle, which is this thing is heavy and huge to carry. This thing is an absolute boat anchor in the pocket. And it's not just because it's heavy, because honestly, 5.2 ounces is not that heavy. Again, I'll pull out my my Eclipse here. It is heavier than the Eclipse, but it's not that much. It's like 0.3 of an ounce heavier than the Eclipse. It's, I think, about the same weight as something like, I've got my CQC 15 here. And it's about the same weight as my CQC 15. But you'll notice these are both much larger knives than the Mini Sub-Hilt. And the Mini Sub-Hilt is denser than either of those. This is a small object that feels like carrying a brick of steel in your pocket. I mean, it feels like when you were a kid carrying a rock in your pocket. It swings around everywhere. You feel it every instant that you're carrying it. Just because it is so dense. There's so much weight per size in here. In the way that, a larger knife, because it's that weight is spread out over more area, can often carry better. This knife just doesn't carry well. You will always feel it in your pocket. You will take up a huge chunk of your pocket just because, again, it is so darn thick. I mean, realistically, you're not carrying anything else in your pocket at the same time as this Sub-Hilt, and if you are, by the way, that bolster, those steel bolsters are going to get scratched to shit. So you end up getting a pretty nice cutting experience, a surprisingly nice cutting experience, and a more than good enough ergonomic experience. It's not winning awards in either case, but it is purely functional enough for a knife that easily could have been form first and could have been, a collector's piece that wasn't designed to work. Spyderco, as usual, comes through and makes a knife that is actually functional as well. The big downside is that this sucks in terms of carry profile. Fit, finish, and value. It's a tie chunk Spyderco. What does that mean? Everything is immaculate in terms of fit and finish. Again, we're not quite talking custom level in terms of, like you can see tiny little gaps between the G10 and the steel. You can feel gas between the G10 and the steel at those transitions. It's not like a Trevor Berger or some of Riot's nicest work, things like that. But the fact is, heavily contoured, polished G10 looks really nice. Really nice even chamfers everywhere. Everything mates up nicely. Again, these grinds are beautiful. A horizontal satin on the flat, a hollow satin on the main grind, and then that little Tonto-ish tip. Really nice factory edge. Everything here is executed exactly as you would expect from Taichung Spyderco, which is to mean it is immaculate. You got that wonderful action. Everything has been rock solid. Nothing to complain about whatsoever in terms of fit and finish. I don't think I've ever complained about anything in terms of fit and finish on a Taichung Spyderco. In terms of value, it's a bit hard to put a value on this knife. Again, it's $300 and change from Spyderco full retail. It was probably about $250 for most retailers. These days, $250 for this knife, given the fit and finish you get and the truly distinctive design, that would be a great price. And considering that these are coming around that price on the secondary market, if not slightly better, this feels like a knife that is certainly reasonably priced for the level of quality and fit and finish that you are getting. I have no issue with Spyderco's S30V on a knife like this. It's a steel that keeps a great edge. Taichung Spyderco heat treats it very well. It is fine. It's stainless enough. It's tough enough. It has great edge retention. I have no issue with that steel. You're not buying this knife for function. And in fact, let's just roll right into the conclusions. At $250, let's say, or let's say $200 on the secondary market, there's no way that I can tell you that this is, the best choice for an EDC knife at $200 or at $225 or $250, anything like that. It's not a bad choice, but that's not why you're buying this. You are buying this knife because you think it looks cool. It's got almost like a medieval look to it. It kind of looks like a suit of armor in knife form. You've got those cool blade stops. You've got this really cool grind. You've got that quirky looking blade. And then of course you've got this massively thick handle that doesn't look like anything else that Spyderco does. Frankly, it doesn't look like much of what anybody is doing right now. This is a truly distinctive knife. And just about everything about it is distinctive. It's not just big, it's not just thick, but it's got a distinctive grind. It's got these blade stops that you don't see all that often outside of a couple of companies. It's got a very good action. There's a lot to love about this knife. But those are mostly sort of aesthetic choices. Those are mostly elements of the cool factor. There's nothing about this knife that is unusually practical, unusually functional. And in fact, with that thickness in mind, it's, let's say, it is worse to carry than just about any other knife of a similar profile. In fact, just because I happen to have it here. If you're looking for something practical, review on this one coming up. This is a tactile knife called Chupacabra. Has about the same blade stock, has an insanely slicey grind, came out for about the same price, but is significantly thinner, is a decent bit lighter, and it's not nearly as distinctive. But the fact is, if you're saying, okay, I want a practical knife, I want something that is relatively easy to carry, that I can push relatively hard, and that will still be nice to look at and feel. The Chupacabra is a better knife for that than the Sub-Hilt. It kind of feels like a dumb comparison. The reason you're buying the little Sub-Hilt, and I'm singling out the Chupacabra, you could put 10 other knives in that position right now, in the $250 price range, with blade stocks around 130 to 140 thousandths that are meant for, the hard use end of EDC. This is not the most practical choice, but it is really cool. It is really distinctive, and it is really well put together. And this blade grind makes the knife actually way better to use than I expected, and frankly way better than it has really any right to be at cutting. I wouldn't be surprised, frankly, if this was even better at cutting than some of the customs, given how well Tai Chung ground this blade. So if you came into this review sort of thinking, that knife looks really cool, I've seen it around somewhere, is it well made? Is it useful enough? Because if I can get some use out of it, then I might want to look into it. I'm going to tell you right now, if you love this design, when you see one on the secondary market, buy it. And especially, I've seen a few that go below $200. For sub $200, if you are a Spyderco collector, this is a really cool thing to have in your collection. It's like nothing else that even Spyderco makes. It's like very little else on the market, and it's very well executed. Even when you carry it from time to time, you're not going to be mad when you use it. You might be mad that it's in your pocket, because it kind of sucks to have it in your pocket. But you're not going to be mad when you use it. It's actually a solid little user. For anybody else who just wants a knife that is good, there's too many things about this knife. Like, even though I talk about how great the grind is, the blade stock is still super thick. Even though this handle is really well designed, it's still super thick. The whole thing is still super heavy and still a boat anchor in the pocket. Like, this isn't a recommendation on practical merits. If you just want a good knife and this design doesn't speak to you, keep looking. Or, if you get it as a novelty. Get it as something that, you're going to keep in your knife case because it's fun. That's where the little sub hilt ends up. I will say as a last note, because I've had a couple comments like this on some of my other videos, I kind of wish Spyderco got back to making knives like this. There was a period about the time that I was getting into knives. This was actually just before I started really getting into knives, that Spyderco was doing tons of these designer collaborations. It's when a lot of the Swish stuff came out. You had this, you had the Siren, you had all sorts of weirder stuff. You had the Amalgam, you had the Myrtle, all sorts of weirder stuff that I can't remember off the top of my head right now. Tai Chung had a ton of them. The McBee came out, I think, around that time. Spyderco used to do lots of distinctive, weird stuff, and they would execute it all really, really well. These days, and I understand it makes sense from a business perspective, but Spyderco is making variations of the PM2, variations of the Native Chief and the Native, variations of the Shaman. Like the Bodacious is a thin Shaman, like stuff like that. It's giving us more useful knives, it's giving us more practical knives, but this is cool, this is interesting. I can't fault Spyderco from moving away from making stuff like this. I'm sure the overall design and tooling and execution expense for these sorts of knives, especially at Tai Chung's tolerances, probably don't make sense financially nearly as much as, just putting out another version of the PM2. But it was a very cool aspect of Spyderco during that era. And it's something that I hope at some point they decide to bring back, that they bring this creativity back, that they start collaborating with more custom designers, high-end designers, and start using those designs to explore things that are outside of their typical, typical pattern. I would also love for them to find, just like they did with, Valentin and with the Subhilt and Little Subhilt, if some of those take off, for them to start doing multiple collaborations with a single designer. Take multiple of their customs and turn them into Spyderco knives, or even have novel designs just from that maker made under the Spyderco brand name. All that stuff would be cool. That's just a wish list now. But one thing that this knife does remind me of is it reminds me of how much Spyderco used to play around and put fun stuff out there. I mean, they know this knife isn't going to sell a bajillion units. It's not practical, it's weird, it's an enthusiast knife. But those enthusiast knives are cool, and I do think that they, help elevate the brand a little bit. That has nothing to do with this knife. That's just about Spyderco in general. But I've seen a couple comments about it on my videos, and I do agree. So anyway, this is the Spyderco Lil Subhilt. Really cool knife. Not something I can recommend on a practical basis, but really cool. Hopefully you found this helpful, and hopefully it gave you everything you need to know to make an informed purchase. And I hope to see you again soon. Have a good day.